She was hiding in a fallen log den when a Modoc hunter found her and said, "If they ask, say you're with me." Northern California. Autumn of 1878. The mountains held their breath as smoke from distant campfires curled into a sky painted with dying light. In a world where a woman alone meant prey, one desperate soul would gamble everything on a stranger's word. The stagecoach had overturned 3 miles back, wheels splintering against granite as the horses screamed and bolted into the wilderness. Violet Winters had not waited to see if the driver survived. She had grabbed her torn skirts, kicked off her ruined heels, and run barefoot into the pines before the dust even settled. Behind her, voices shouted commands. Men on horseback, their spurs jingling like death bells in the twilight. They were not rescuers. They were hunters, and she was the prize her employer had paid them to retrieve. Dead or alive made no difference to Silas Gannon, the man who owned the Silver Rose Saloon and believed he owned her too. Violet had worked the tables and the stage for 2 years, singing for drunken miners and dodging grabbing hands every night. She had smiled when Silas told her she was special, that he would take care of her. She had believed him until the night he locked her in the back room and told her she belonged to him now, that he had bought her contract from the previous owner, and she would work until the debt was paid. A debt she had never agreed to. A debt that grew with every meal, every dress, every breath she took under his roof, so she had run. Stolen a seat on the northbound stage with money lifted from a passed-out gambler's coat. She had made it 40 miles before Silas's men caught up. The driver had tried to outrun them, and now he was probably dead in a ravine, and she was alone in a forest that did not care whether she lived or died. The autumn air bit at her skin through the thin fabric of her green satin dress, meant for stage lights and cigar smoke, not survival. Her feet bled from sharp rocks and broken twigs. Her lungs burned as she climbed higher into the mountains, following nothing but instinct and the fading light. She could hear them behind her, closer now, their horses snorting as they picked through the undergrowth. Violet stumbled over a root and fell hard, palms scraping against moss-covered stone. She lay there for a moment, chest heaving, tasting copper and fear. Then she saw it, a massive fallen cedar, hollowed by time and rot, its interior dark and deep enough to hide a desperate woman. She crawled inside without thinking, pulling herself into the damp earthen chamber, where roots twisted like fingers and beetles scattered at her intrusion. The voices grew louder. Boots hit the ground. Someone whistled, sharp and mocking. Violet pressed herself against the back of the log, hands over her mouth to silence her breathing. Through a crack in the wood, she could see firelight flickering between the trees. 3 men, maybe 4, spreading out to search. "She cannot have gone far," one of them called. His voice was rough, amused. "City girl in the wild? She will be crying for her mama by now," another laughed. "Silas wants her back in one piece, but he did not say she had to be unmarked. I say we have a little fun when we find her." Violet's stomach turned. She closed her eyes and prayed to a God she was not sure listened anymore. The footsteps came closer. A shadow passed near the log. She held her breath until her vision spotted with stars. Then a new sound cut through the forest. A low, sharp whistle, not like the mocking calls of the hunters. This one was different, a signal, a warning. The men stopped talking. Violet heard the metallic click of a rifle being cocked. "Who is there?" One of the hunters demanded. Silence. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. Tall, lean, moving with the kind of silence that spoke of a life spent in these mountains. He wore buckskin and wool, a rifle slung across his back, a bow in his hand. His hair was black as midnight, tied back with a strip of leather. His face was all hard angles and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Modoc, Violet realized. She had seen his people in the border towns, trading pelts and venison, keeping to themselves, watching the white settlers with expressions that revealed nothing. "This is not your business, Indian," the lead hunter said, stepping forward with his pistol raised. Move along, the Modoc man, taken wolf tracker, though Violet did not yet know his name, tilted his head slightly. You are on my land, he said. His voice was quiet, steady, and somehow more dangerous because of it. You track something through my hunting grounds without permission. We are tracking a thief, the hunter spat. A woman who stole from her employer. Law says we can retrieve stolen property. Your law, Taken replied. Not mine, the tension stretched thin as wire. Violet could see it in the way the hunters shifted their weight, hands hovering near weapons. Taken did not move. He simply stood there, an immovable stone in the path of a river that suddenly seemed less certain of its course. We do not want trouble, another hunter said, trying diplomacy. Just let us search the area and we will be gone. There is nothing here but trees and spirits, Taken said. And both will be angry if you disturb them further. Go back to your towns. Your hunt ends here. The lead hunter's face twisted with rage. You do not give me orders, savage. In one fluid motion, Taken had an arrow knocked and drawn, the bowstring pulled taut. The hunters froze. The firelight caught the obsidian arrowhead, sharp enough to split bone. I do not give orders, Taken said softly. I give you a choice. Leave now or stay forever. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the lead hunter spat into the dirt and jerked his head toward the horses. This is not over, he growled. Silas Gannon does not forget. Neither do we. Then remember this, Taken said, lowering his bow but not unstring it. These mountains do not forgive men who hunt for sport instead of need. If you return, you will not leave. The hunters mounted up, cursing under their breath, and rode back down the mountain trail. Their torchlight faded into the distance until only darkness and cricket song remained. Violet stayed frozen in the log, not daring to believe they were truly gone. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. Taken stood still for a long moment, listening. Then he turned his head slightly and spoke to the forest itself. You can come out now. Violet's breath caught. He knew, of course he knew. Men like him did not survive in the wilderness by missing signs. She hesitated, then slowly crawled out of the hollow log, her dress catching on splinters, her hair wild with leaves and dirt. She stood on shaking legs, barefoot and bleeding, and met his eyes. They were dark, unreadable, but not unkind. He looked her over once, assessing, then nodded as if confirming something to himself. You are the one they hunt, he said. It was not a question. Violet swallowed hard. Yes, why? She lifted her chin, finding some scrap of defiance beneath the fear. Because I would not be owned. Something flickered in his expression, too quick to name. He glanced back down the trail where the hunters had vanished, then looked at her again. They will return. Men like that always do. And they will bring more, I know, Violet whispered. Her voice cracked. I have nowhere else to go. Taken was silent for a moment, considering. Then he unslung a skin of water from his belt and held it out to her. She took it with trembling hands and drank deeply, the cool liquid washing away the taste of dust and terror. When she finished, he took it back and studied her with those sharp, measuring eyes. Can you walk? He asked. I think so. Then follow me. My camp is not far. You will be safer there than out here when the cold comes. Violet hesitated. She knew nothing about this man, except that he had just saved her life. But what choice did she have? Freeze to death alone in the mountains, or trust a stranger who had faced down armed men without flinching? She took a shaky breath and nodded. Taken turned and began walking into the forest without looking back to see if she followed. Violet glanced once more at the darkness where the hunters had disappeared, then hurried after him, her bare feet finding purchase on the forest floor as best they could. He moved like a shadow, barely disturbing the underbrush, while she crashed along behind him like a wounded deer. If he noticed, he did not comment. They walked for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than an hour. The trees grew denser, the darkness deeper. Violet's feet screamed with every step, but she did not complain. She focused on the broad shape of Taken's back ahead of her, on putting one foot in front of the other, on not collapsing from exhaustion and fear. Finally, they emerged into a small clearing where a stream bubbled over smooth stones. A simple shelter stood against the hillside, built from pine branches and hides, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. A fire ring sat cold and dark in the center. Taken moved to it immediately, pulling kindling and striking flint with practiced ease. Within minutes, flames crackled to life, pushing back the night. Violet stood at the edge of the firelight, unsure what to do with herself. She wrapped her arms around her body, shivering now that the adrenaline was fading and the cold was settling in. Taken glanced at her, then disappeared into the shelter. He returned a moment later with a thick blanket made of woven rabbit fur and deerskin. He held it out without a word. She took it gratefully and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming. Her eyes stung with sudden tears. "Thank you," she managed. Taken nodded once and returned to the fire. He set a small pot of water to boil and added dried herbs from a pouch at his belt. The smell was earthy and clean, nothing like the whiskey and tobacco stench of the Silver Rose. Violet sank down onto a flat stone near the fire, pulling the blanket tight. Her feet throbbed, blood dried black on her skin. "Let me see," Taken said, crouching beside her. She flinched instinctively, and he paused, hands raised slightly. "I will not hurt you. But if those cuts get infected, you will not walk again." Violet hesitated, then slowly extended one foot. Taken examined it with the same careful attention he had given everything else, his touch surprisingly gentle. He fetched clean water and cloth from his shelter and began washing away the dirt and blood. She hissed at the sting, but he did not stop, working methodically until both feet were clean. Then he applied a paste made from crushed leaves that cooled the burning and wrapped them in soft strips of hide. "Rest," he said, sitting back. "In the morning, we will decide what comes next." Violet watched him across the fire. He moved with such quiet certainty, like the forest itself had taught him where to step and when to be still. She wanted to ask him why he had helped her, why he had risked confrontation with armed men for a stranger. But exhaustion was pulling at her now, dragging her down into a dark place where questions did not matter. "What is your name?" she asked instead, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked at her through the flames. "Taken Wolf Tracker, I am Violet." "Violet Winters." He nodded as if the name meant something, though she could not imagine what. Then he added more wood to the fire and settled back against a log, his rifle within easy reach. "Sleep, Violet Winters. You are safe here tonight." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that safety was something that could exist for someone like her. But as she curled up beneath the borrowed blanket and let her eyes close, she could still hear the echo of the hunter's words in her mind. "This is not over. Silas Gannon does not forget." The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks dancing into the black sky like fireflies seeking heaven. Violet lay on her side, the rabbit fur blanket tucked beneath her chin, watching Taken through half-closed eyes. He sat motionless as carved stone, his rifle across his knees, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. She wondered if he ever truly slept, or if men like him had learned to rest with one eye open, always listening, always ready. The forest sang its night song around them. Owls called from distant branches, their voices low and mournful. Something small rustled through the underbrush, and somewhere far away a wolf howled, lonely and fierce. The sound made Violet shiver despite the warmth of the fire. In the saloon, danger had worn fancy suits and false smiles. Out here, it wore fur and fangs and moved through shadows. She was not sure which terrified her more. The wolves will not come near the fire, Taken said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. They hunt deer and elk, not people. Unless provoked. And the men? Violet asked. Will they come back tonight? Taken was silent for a moment, his eyes still scanning the darkness. No, they will regroup first, bring reinforcements. They were not prepared to face resistance. Tomorrow, perhaps the day after, they will return with more guns and less patience. Then I should leave, Violet said, pushing herself up on one elbow. I should not bring this trouble to you. Where will you go? Taken asked, his tone matter-of-fact rather than mocking. North to Oregon? The settlements there answer to the same law that sent those men after you. East to the territories? You would not survive the crossing alone. South back to California? That is where they came from. Violet had no answer. She sank back down, feeling the weight of her helplessness press against her chest like a stone. Then what do I do? Taken fed another log to the fire, watching the flames climb and twist. You stay. For now. Until we find a better path. Why would you do that? Violet asked, her voice breaking. You do not know me. You owe me nothing. Those men will come back with more, like you said. They will hurt you because of me. Taken turned his head to look at her fully for the first time since they had sat down. In the firelight, his features were sharp and serious, but there was something else there too, something that reminded Violet of old scars and older grief. 3 winters ago, he said slowly, soldiers came to my village. They said we had to leave our land, that settlers needed it more than we did. My sister refused. She was young, stubborn, like you. She believed the law would protect her because we had done nothing wrong. He paused, jaw tightening. They dragged her from our home and beat her in front of everyone. My father tried to stop them. They shot him. When I tried to fight back, they tied me to a post and made me watch as they burned everything we had built. Our home, our food stores, our history. They left us with nothing but ash and orders to move north by spring. Violet's breath caught. Your sister, she lived, Taken said. But she was never the same. The light went out of her. She stopped speaking, stopped eating. By the time winter ended, she was gone. Not taken by soldiers, but by despair. Sometimes that kills just as surely as a bullet. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Violet saw it now, the reason he had stepped between her and those hunters. It was not about her at all. It was about a girl he could not save, a debt he could never repay. A guilt that followed him through these mountains, like a shadow that refused to fade. I am sorry, Violet whispered. Taken shook his head. Do not be sorry. Be alive. That is enough, he stood then, moving to check the perimeter of the camp with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. Violet watched him disappear into the darkness and return moments later, satisfied that nothing lurked beyond the firelight. He settled back against his log and closed his eyes, though she suspected he was not truly sleeping, merely resting while remaining alert. Violet lay back down and pulled the blanket up to her chin. The fire warmed her front while the cold night air nipped at her back. She thought about Taken's sister, about how many women like her existed in this world, caught between men who believed they had the right to own or destroy anything weaker than themselves. She thought about Silas Gannon and his hunters, about the Silver Rose and the cage it had been. She thought about freedom and what it actually meant when you had nowhere safe to claim it. Sleep came in fragments, pulling her under in brief waves before some sound or shift in the wind would jolt her awake again. Each time she would see Taken still there, still watching, and somehow that was enough to let her slip back into uneasy dreams. In those dreams she was running again, but this time the forest did not end. It went on forever, and no matter how fast she ran, the voices behind her never faded. They just kept coming, kept calling her name, kept promising her that she could never escape what she was born to be. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold, Violet woke to find Taken already up and moving. He had caught fish from the stream and was cooking them over the rebuilt fire. The smell made her stomach clench with sudden hunger. She could not remember the last time she had eaten anything more substantial than stale bread and watered-down soup. Taken glanced at her as she sat up. "Eat," he said, handing her a piece of cooked trout on a flat stone. "You will need your strength." Violet took it gratefully and ate without bothering with manners or grace. The fish was simple, seasoned only with smoke and salt, but it tasted better than anything she had eaten in months. Taken ate his own portion in silence, watching the sun rise through the trees, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. "What happens now?" Violet asked when she had finished. Taken stood and brushed off his hands. "Now we make a choice. If those men return and find you here, they will take you. If they find you with me, they will ask questions. What kind of questions? Who you are, where you came from, why you are with a Modoc hunter instead of on a stage headed somewhere civilized," Taken said. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. "We need a story they will believe. One that gives you protection under my name." Violet's heart began to beat faster. "What kind of story?" Taken crouched down in front of her so they were eye to eye. "If they ask," he said slowly, deliberately, "you tell them you are with me. Not as a runaway. Not as a stranger I found in the woods. You tell them you are my woman. That you came here by choice. That you belong to no one but yourself, and you chose to stay." Violet stared at him. "They will never believe that. They do not have to believe it," Taken replied. "They just have to be uncertain enough to hesitate. And in that hesitation, we find our advantage. But why would you do this?" Violet asked again, searching his face for answers. "Why would you tie yourself to my trouble?" Taken stood and turned away, looking out at the forest that had raised him. "Because I could not save my sister," he said quietly. "But maybe I can save you." And in that moment, Violet understood that this was not just about her survival. It was about his redemption. Two broken people, each carrying ghosts they could not bury, finding in each other a chance to rewrite an ending that had already been written in blood and ash. It was fragile and dangerous, and probably doomed from the start. But it was also the only chance either of them had. "All right," Violet said, standing on her bandaged feet. She met Taken's eyes and did not look away. "If they ask, I am with you," Taken nodded once, a warrior's acknowledgement of a pact made. "Then we prepare. Because they are coming." The morning sun burned off the mist that clung to the valley floor like a living thing. Violet stood at the edge of Taken's camp, wearing clothes he had given her from a bundle kept in his shelter. The buckskin dress was too large, made for someone taller and broader, but it was warm and practical in ways her torn satin gown had never been. Her feet, still wrapped in his careful bandages, no longer screamed with every step. She felt almost human again. Taken was teaching her to move quietly through the forest, a skill she had never imagined needing in her previous life of stages and saloons. He walked ahead of her, occasionally stopping to point out a broken twig or disturbed leaves, signs that told stories to those who knew how to read them. A deer had passed this way at dawn. A fox had hunted here during the night. 3 days ago, men on horses had ridden through, their tracks still visible in the soft earth near the creek. "You step like you are angry at the ground," Taken said, without turning around. There was no judgment in his voice, just observation. "The forest hears everything. If you want to survive here, you must learn to apologize with every footfall." Violet tried to soften her steps, rolling her weight from heel to toe, the way he had shown her. It felt unnatural, deliberate, like learning to write with her opposite hand. But slowly, the forest stopped announcing her presence with every crack and rustle. Taken glanced back and gave a small nod of approval. They spent the morning gathering plants he said would be useful. Yarrow for wounds, willow bark for pain, wild onions for eating, cattail roots that could be pounded into flour. Violet watched as his hands moved with certainty, never hesitating, never doubting which plant to take and which to leave alone. He showed her how to thank the earth for what they harvested, a quiet prayer spoken in his own language that she did not understand but felt in her bones. "Your people do not do this?" Taken asked as they knelt beside a patch of edible mushrooms. "My people take what they want and pay for it with money," Violet replied. "We do not ask permission from the ground." "Then your people do not understand debt," Taken said. "Everything taken must be repaid, or the balance tips. When the balance tips too far, the world corrects itself. Sometimes gently, sometimes with blood." Violet thought about Silas Gannon and his ledgers, how he had kept her trapped with numbers on paper that grew faster than she could ever pay them down. That had been debt too, she supposed, but a different kind. A false kind, built on lies and leverage rather than genuine exchange. She wondered what Taken would think of such things, but she did not ask. By midday, they returned to camp with their gatherings. Taken showed her how to prepare the cattail roots, pounding them between stones until they broke down into a rough flour. It was hard work that made her arms ache and her hands blister, but she did not complain. There was something honest about this kind of labor, something that made her feel less like a decoration and more like a person with purpose. "You learn quickly," Taken observed as she worked. "Most would have given up by now. Most have not spent 2 years dodging drunks and learning to smile while men grabbed at them," Violet replied. Her voice was sharper than she intended, but she did not apologize. "I learned a long time ago that survival means doing what you must, even when it hurts." Taken studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Then you will survive this too." That afternoon, as the sun climbed toward its peak, riders appeared on the ridge above the valley. Violet saw them first, 3 dark shapes moving against the skyline. Her heart seized in her chest, and she dropped the stone she had been using, the sound loud in the sudden silence. Taken was beside her in an instant, his hand on her arm, steady and grounding. "Do not run," he said quietly. "Running makes you pray. Stand with me." The riders descended the slope slowly, deliberately, their horses picking careful paths through the rocks and scrub. As they drew closer, Violet recognized one of them from the night before, the lead hunter with the cruel eyes and the pistol always within reach. But the other 2 were new. One was older, gray-haired and thick around the middle, wearing a badge that caught the sunlight. The third was younger, cleaner, dressed in a suit that looked absurdly out of place in the wilderness. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, and the man with the badge dismounted first. He moved with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. The hunter from the previous night stayed mounted, his eyes fixed on Violet with an intensity that made her skin crawl. The young man in the suit dismounted last, brushing dust from his sleeves with distaste. "Morning," the badge said, his voice carrying across the camp. "Name is Marshal Wade Thornton. I am looking for a woman who went missing from a stagecoach 3 days back. Young, red-haired, wearing a green dress. You seen anyone like that?" Taken stood perfectly still, his expression revealing nothing. "I have seen many things in these mountains, Marshal." "You will need to be more specific." The Marshal's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do not play games with me, Wolf Tracker. I know you are out here. Your people always are. But this is official business. A young woman is in danger, and I need to know if you have seen her." "Define danger," Taken replied evenly. The young man in the suit stepped forward, his face flushed with irritation. "I am Richard Caldwell, attorney representing Mr. Silas Gannon of Sacramento. The woman in question is Miss Violet Winters, an employee who fled her legal obligations and stole property in the process. Mr. Gannon has every right to retrieve what belongs to him." "People do not belong to other people," Taken said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "Not even in your laws. She signed a contract," Caldwell snapped. "She owes a debt. That makes her accountable under territorial law. Now I will ask you one more time. Have you seen this woman? Violet felt Taken's hand slide to the small of her back. A subtle pressure that said, stay calm, trust me, let me handle this. She took a breath and stepped forward, moving to stand beside him rather than behind him. All three men turned their attention to her immediately. I am Violet Winters, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. And I am not missing. I am exactly where I choose to be. The hunter grinned, leaning forward in his saddle. Well, now, there she is.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Told you I tracked her right, Marshal. She is just where I said she would be, hiding with the Indian. I am not hiding, Violet said, lifting her chin. I am staying. Marshal Thornton's expression shifted from business to confusion. Ma'am, are you saying this man took you against your will? No, Violet said firmly. I am saying I came here of my own choice, and I am staying of my own choice. I owe Silas Gannon nothing. The debt he claims I signed for was manufactured through fraud and coercion. I never agreed to be bound to him. Caldwell pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and waved it like a weapon. This contract says otherwise. Your signature is right here, Miss Winters. Legal and binding. You agreed to work for Mr. Gannon until your debt was satisfied, and you left before that debt was paid. That makes you a thief. That makes him a liar, Violet shot back. He added charges I never incurred, inflated prices for things I never received, and when I questioned him, he locked me in a room and told me I would never leave until I accepted my place. Is that what your law protects, Mr. Caldwell? The right of men to imprison women with false debts and pretty words. The attorney's face darkened. You are making serious accusations without proof, and you are enforcing serious claims without questioning their validity, Taken interjected. This woman says she was coerced. Your paper says she was contracted. One of these truths is real, and one is convenient. A wise man would wonder which is which. Marshal Thornton held up a hand, his expression thoughtful. All right, everyone calm down. Miss Winters, I need to understand your situation clearly. You are saying you do not wish to return to Sacramento. I would rather die, Violet said simply. And you are here with this man because... Violet felt Taken's hand press gently against her back again. A silent reminder of the story they had agreed upon. She took his hand in hers, lacing their fingers together in a gesture that looked natural but felt like jumping off a cliff. Because I am with him. Not as a captive, not as a runaway. I am here because this is where I belong. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. The hunter laughed, a harsh bark of disbelief. You expect us to believe that? That a saloon girl and a savage are playing house in the woods? Watch your tongue, Taken said, his voice soft and lethal. Or I will cut it out and feed it to the crows. The hunter's hand moved toward his gun, but Marshal Thornton stopped him with a sharp gesture. Enough. Nobody is drawing on anybody today. He turned back to Violet, his eyes searching her face. Miss Winters, I need you to be absolutely clear with me. Are you here of your own free will? Yes. Has this man harmed you or threatened you in any way? No. He saved my life. The marshal looked between them, clearly trying to piece together a puzzle that did not fit his expectations. And you intend to stay here in these mountains with him? Violet squeezed Taken's hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of a life lived in survival mode. Yes, Caldwell stepped forward again, his face twisted with frustration. Marshal, this is clearly a case of Stockholm captivity or some form of manipulation. The woman is not thinking clearly. We have a legal right to retrieve her. You have a piece of paper, Taken said. Paper burns. Rights do not. Are you threatening us? Caldwell demanded. I am informing you, Taken replied. Violet Winters is under my protection. If you try to take her, you will have to go through me. And I promise you, that is not a path you want to walk. The marshal rubbed his jaw, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this conversation had taken. Look, I am not in the business of dragging women away from where they want to be. But I also cannot ignore a legal contract just because someone changed their mind about the terms. Miss Winters, if you have proof that Mr. Gannon defrauded you, you need to bring it before a judge. The only judge in Sacramento is Harold Brennan, Violet said bitterly. And he takes his meals at the Silver Rose 3 times a week. Do you think he will rule against a man who feeds him and a business that fills his pockets? I would be back in Silas's chains before the ink dried on the complaint. Thornton sighed, the sound of a man caught between duty and decency. Then we have a problem, because I cannot just walk away from this. Mr. Gannon has connections. And if I return empty-handed, he will make noise that reaches all the way to the territorial governor. Then tell him she is dead, Taken said suddenly. All eyes turned to him. Tell him she ran into the mountains and did not survive. Tell him you found her dress torn on rocks near a cliff face, evidence of a fall. Tell him whatever you need to tell him to close your ledger and leave us in peace. You are asking me to lie in an official report, Thornton said slowly. I am asking you to choose between a paper truth and a living one, Taken replied. You seem like a man who understands the difference. The marshal was quiet for a long time, his eyes moving between Violet and Taken, weighing options that all seemed to carry consequences. Finally, he shook his head. I cannot do that. But what I can do is report that I found Miss Winters alive and well, staying with a local resident by her own stated choice, and that she refused to return. What Mr. Gannon does with that information is his business, not mine. He will come himself, the hunter said with certainty. With more men, more guns. You know he will. Then he will be making a mistake, Taken said, his voice calm but absolute. These mountains do not care how much money a man has or how many guns he brings. They care only whether he knows how to listen and when to leave. Mr. Gannon would be wise to learn the difference. Caldwell looked like he wanted to argue further. But Marshal Thornton was already mounting his horse. Miss Winters, I hope you know what you are doing. This is not going to end quietly. Nothing in my life has ever ended quietly, Violet replied. I have learned to live with noise. The marshal tipped his hat, a gesture of respect if not agreement, and turned his horse back toward the ridge. Caldwell followed, still sputtering objections that no one was listening to. The hunter lingered for a moment longer, his eyes promising violence yet to come. Then he too wheeled his horse around and rode after the others. Violet watched them disappear over the ridge, her hand still clasped in Taken's. She waited until the sound of hooves faded completely before she let out the breath she had been holding. Her legs suddenly felt weak, and she sank down onto a nearby log, her whole body trembling with delayed fear. Taken knelt in front of her, his hands on her shoulders, steady and grounding. You did well, he said quietly. You did not break. I wanted to, Violet admitted. When that hunter looked at me, I wanted to run so badly I could taste it, but you did not, Taken said. That is what matters. Fear is not weakness, Violet. Acting on fear without thought, that is weakness. You stood your ground. That takes strength most people never find. Violet looked up at him. This man who had appeared out of darkness to save her, who had given her shelter and taught her how to move through the world without apology. What happens now? She asked. The marshal was right. Silas will come, and he will bring hell with him. Then we prepare for hell, Taken said simply. He stood and offered her his hand. Come, I will show you how to shoot. The rest of the afternoon was spent in education that Violet had never imagined receiving. Taken taught her how to hold a rifle, how to breathe and aim and squeeze rather than pull. He taught her that shooting was not about anger or fear, but about clarity and purpose. Every bullet had a cost, he explained, and wasting them on poor aim or panic was the same as throwing away your life. Violet's first shots went wide, kicking up dirt and splintering bark from trees that were not her target. But slowly, with Taken's patient guidance, she began to find the rhythm of it. The weight of the rifle became familiar. The kick against her shoulder became expected. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, she had managed to hit a makeshift target 3 times out of 10 attempts. "Not bad," Taken said, a hint of something that might have been pride in his voice. "Most people cannot hit anything their first day. You have steady hands and a desperate need to survive," Violet replied, lowering the rifle. Her shoulder ached and her ears rang from the gunfire, but she felt something new stirring inside her. Not confidence exactly, but possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, she was not as helpless as she had always believed. That night, they sat by the fire again, but the silence between them was different now. It was no longer the careful distance of strangers, but something closer to companionship. Taken carved a piece of wood with a knife that looked older than he was, his hands moving with unconscious grace. Violet watched the flames and thought about everything that had changed in just a few days. "Tell me about your sister," she said suddenly. The words were out before she could stop them, but she did not take them back. "What was her name?" Taken's hand stilled on the carving. For a moment, Violet thought he would not answer, that she had pushed too far into territory marked with pain. But then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "Ayana. It means eternal blossom. My mother named her that because she was born in spring, when everything was blooming and new." "It is a beautiful name," Violet said. "She was a beautiful soul," Taken replied. "Strong and fierce and certain of her place in the world. She believed that if we were good, if we followed the rules and caused no harm, we would be left in peace. She could not understand that some people do not care about right or wrong. They only care about what they can take." Violet understood that lesson all too well. "I am sorry you lost her. I am sorry I could not save her," Taken said. "I was tied to a post, forced to watch everything burn, and I could do nothing but scream until my voice was gone. When they finally cut me loose, I tried to find her, but she had vanished into the chaos. When I finally did find her, weeks later, she was alive but empty. Like someone had reached inside and stolen her spirit." He set down the carving and looked at Violet across the flames. "That is why I will not let them take you. Not because you remind me of her, but because I know what happens when good people stand by and let evil have its way. The world does not balance itself. We have to balance it." Violet felt tears prick at her eyes, hot and unexpected. "What if we cannot stop them? What if Silas brings too many men, too many guns? Then we will face them anyway," Taken said. "Because the alternative is letting fear decide how we live, and that is not living at all. That is just waiting to die," Violet nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. She stood and walked around the fire to sit beside Taken, close enough that their shoulders touched. He did not pull away. They sat like that for a long time. Two damaged people sharing warmth and silence while the forest sang its ancient songs around them. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called out, its voice both mournful and defiant. Violet thought it sounded like a promise and a warning all at once. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new reasons to run or fight or break. But tonight, she was not alone. Tonight, she had an ally who understood that survival was not just about staying alive, but about choosing what you were willing to die for. And as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, Violet Winters made a choice. She would not run anymore. She would not hide or beg or break. She would stand, and if standing meant falling, then she would fall on her own terms, with her eyes open and her voice loud. Because Taken was right. The world did not balance itself, they would have to balance it. 3 days passed like water through cupped hands, each one bringing Violet deeper into a life she had never imagined living. She woke with the sun now, her body adjusting to rhythms dictated by light and season rather than whiskey songs and card games. Taken taught her to track deer through the undergrowth, to read the language written in bent grass and disturbed soil. He showed her how to set snares for rabbits, how to skin and clean what they caught, how to waste nothing because the forest gave only what you earned through respect and skill. Her hands, once soft from saloon work that required only carrying trays and looking pretty, now bore calluses and small cuts that she wore like badges of competence. She learned to start fires with flint and steel, to identify which mushrooms would feed and which would kill, to move through the woods without announcing her presence to every creature within a mile. The buckskin dress Taken had given her no longer felt too large. She had adjusted it with sinew and patience, making it fit her frame, making it hers. But beneath the routine of survival, tension coiled like a rattlesnake waiting to strike. Taken checked the perimeter of their camp every morning and evening, reading signs that Violet was only beginning to understand. Fresh horse tracks on the game trail 2 miles south. Broken branches that spoke of men moving clumsily through terrain they did not know. The distant echo of voices carried on the wind from the valley below. "They are watching," Taken said one evening as they prepared their meal. "Not close enough to attack, but close enough to learn our patterns. They are waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" Violet asked, turning the rabbit meat on the makeshift spit. "Reinforcements. Or orders, or the right moment when our guard is down," Taken replied. He sharpened his knife against a whetstone, the rhythmic scraping sound somehow both soothing and ominous. "Silas Gannon is not a patient man, but he is a careful one. He will not move until he is certain of victory." Violet stirred the pot of wild onions and roots, watching the steam rise into the cooling air. "How do you know so much about men like him?" "Because I have fought men like him before," Taken said. "During the war between your people, I scouted for the Union Army, not because I believed in their cause, but because they promised to protect Modoc land if we helped them. They lied, of course. But I learned many things about how white men think, how they fight, how they justify taking whatever they want and calling it righteousness." He tested the edge of his knife against his thumb, nodded in satisfaction, and slid it back into its sheath. "Gannon will come with overwhelming force, because men like him cannot imagine losing to people they consider beneath them. He will bring guns and men and the weight of law he has purchased with gold. And he will expect us to surrender because in his mind, there is no other logical choice. But we will not surrender," Violet said. It was not a question. "No," Taken agreed. "We will not." That night, Violet could not sleep. She lay in the shelter Taken had built, listening to the forest sounds that had become familiar. The owl calls and cricket songs, and the occasional howl of distant coyotes. Taken slept outside by the fire, as he always did, keeping watch even in his rest. She wondered if he ever truly relaxed, or if survival had trained him to exist in a constant state of readiness. She thought about the silver rose, about the life she had fled. It seemed like something from another world now, a fever dream of smoke and false laughter and hands that grabbed without permission. She had been so desperate to escape that cage that she had not stopped to consider what freedom actually meant. Freedom was not just the absence of chains. It was the presence of choice, the ability to decide each day who you would be and what you would fight for. And she had chosen this. Chosen Taken, chosen these mountains, chosen a life that made no sense by the standards of the world she had left behind. She was a saloon girl playing at being a frontier woman, learning skills she had no business knowing, preparing for a violence she had spent her whole life avoiding. It should have felt absurd. Instead, it felt right. The next morning brought visitors of a different kind. Violet was gathering water from the stream when she heard voices, light and musical, speaking in a language she did not understand. She froze, her hand reaching instinctively for the knife Taken had given her. But before she could move, 3 figures emerged from the tree line. 2 women and a young boy, all Modoc, dressed in a mixture of traditional and traded clothing. The older woman had silver streaking her dark hair and eyes that seemed to see through skin and bone to whatever truth lay beneath. The younger woman carried a basket of herbs and roots, her movements graceful and assured. The boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, clutched a small bow and looked at Violet with open curiosity. The older woman spoke, her words flowing like water over stones. Violet shook her head helplessly. "I do not understand." The woman switched to English, her accent thick but clear. "I said, you are the one Taken Wolf Tracker has taken under his protection. The one the white men hunt." "Yes," Violet admitted, seeing no point in lying. "I am Violet Winters." The older woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded as if confirming something she had already suspected. "I am Kiona. This is my daughter Elu, and my grandson Needies. We came to see if the stories are true." "What stories?" Violet asked cautiously. "That Taken has finally allowed another soul into his solitude," Kiona said. "For 3 winters he has lived alone in these mountains, speaking to no one, accepting help from no one, carrying his grief like stones in a pack that grows heavier each season. We had begun to wonder if he would ever rejoin the living." Elu stepped forward, her expression kind. "We brought medicines and food. Taken is skilled at survival, but he is not skilled at accepting comfort. Perhaps you can convince him to take what is offered." Violet glanced back toward the camp, where she knew Taken would be aware of their presence, even if he had not yet shown himself. "I am not sure I have that kind of influence." "You are here," Kiona said simply. "That alone is influence. Come, let us return to your camp. It has been too long since we have spoken with Wolf Tracker, and I would see with my own eyes that he still walks among the living and not the ghosts." They walked together back to the clearing, the boy Needies darting ahead to scout the path like he was on some grand adventure. When they emerged into the camp, Taken was waiting, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. When he saw Kiona, something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening, a recognition of connection that went deeper than words. "Grandmother," he said, using the term of respect rather than blood relation. "You should not have made this journey. The path is difficult." "The path has always been difficult," Kiona replied, setting down her bundle. "That has never stopped me before." "Will you turn away an old woman who has brought you dried venison and nettle tea?" "I would not dare," Taken said, and there was something in his voice that might have been humor. "Your wrath is more fearsome than any rifle," Kiona laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "You have learned wisdom in your isolation, Wolf Tracker. Good. Now, introduce me properly to this woman who has accomplished what we could not. Bringing you back from the edge of the world." Taken gestured toward Violet, who suddenly felt very aware of her borrowed clothing and her still awkward movements. "This is Violet Winters. She is under my protection." "She is more than that," Kiona said, studying Violet with those penetrating eyes. "She is the reason you have started building again instead of simply surviving. I can see it in how you stand, in how you watch her when you think no one notices. You have found something worth protecting beyond your own breath." Taken said nothing, but Violet saw color rise in his neck, barely visible against his skin. Elu began unpacking the bundle, laying out strips of dried meat, pouches of tea and herbs, and a small clay pot sealed with wax. "This is bear grease mixed with yarrow," she explained to Violet, "for wounds and to keep skin from cracking in the cold. Winter comes early in these mountains." Needies approached Violet shyly, holding out a small carved figure of a wolf. "My uncle made this before he went away," the boy said in careful English. "Grandmother says you should have it. For protection." Violet took the carving gently, feeling the smoothness of wood worn by many hands. "Thank you, Needies, I will treasure it." The boy beamed and ran back to his mother's side. Kiona settled herself on a log by the fire pit, her movements deliberate and careful in the way of those whose bodies have earned their aches through long living. Now, tell me true, Taken Wolf Tracker. What storm approaches? I have seen men in the valleys below, asking questions in the trading posts, offering gold for information about a red-haired woman and the Indian who hides her. Taken's expression hardened. They have been to the trading posts 3 days ago, Kiona confirmed. They showed a drawing, crude but recognizable. They said she is a thief and a liar, that they have legal authority to retrieve her. Some believed them. Others did not. But gold speaks loudly to hungry mouths, and winter is coming. Someone will talk eventually. Violet felt her stomach drop. She had known this was coming, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a way that speculation had not. I have brought danger to all of you, she said quietly. I should leave, go further north where they cannot follow. You would not survive the journey alone, Elu said matter-of-factly. And even if you did, you would only be running toward the same fate in a different place. Men like these do not stop hunting because you make their job harder. They stop only when the cost becomes too high, or when there is nothing left to hunt, Kiona added, her voice grave. She looked at Taken. You know what is coming. You have always known. The question is whether you will face it alone, or whether you will accept that some battles require more than one warrior. Taken was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he wrestled with something internal. Finally, he spoke. I will not ask others to fight my battles. This is not your battle alone, Kiona said sharply. This is about all of us. These men who hunt Violet today will hunt others tomorrow. They represent a world that believes it can take whatever it wants simply because it has the power to do so. If we do not stand against that, we are complicit in our own erasure. Grandmother speaks truth, Elu said quietly. There are others who would stand with you, Taken. You have been gone from us, but you are not forgotten. The young men speak of you, of how you fought in the white man's war and returned with skills none of us possess. They would follow you if you asked. I do not want to lead anyone to their death, Taken said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely showed. Then lead them to their purpose, Kiona replied. There is a difference. Death comes for us all eventually, Wolf Tracker. But purpose, that is something we must claim for ourselves. The conversation continued through the morning. Kiona and Elu sharing news from the scattered Modoc communities that still clung to their traditional lands, despite increasing pressure to relocate. They spoke of families struggling to feed themselves as game grew scarce, of young people caught between worlds that wanted nothing from them but compliance or disappearance. They spoke of hope, too, small and fragile but persistent, the kind that grew in harsh soil because it had no other choice. Needy showed Violet how to string a small bow he had made from willow branches, his young hands surprisingly skilled. She learned that his father had died 2 winters ago in a hunting accident, that Elu had raised him alone with Kiona's help, that he dreamed of becoming a great hunter like the uncle he barely remembered. She listened and learned and felt the weight of all these interconnected lives. All these people who existed in the spaces between the world she had known and the world Taken inhabited. When the sun began its descent, Kiona stood with some effort, accepting Elu's steadying hand. We must return before dark. The path is treacherous in twilight. Taken walked them to the edge of the clearing, speaking quietly with Kiona in their shared language. Violet could not understand the words, but she understood the body language, the way Kiona gripped his arm, the way he bowed his head in respect or perhaps acceptance. When they finished, Kiona turned to Violet. You have stirred something in him that we thought was dead, the old woman said. Whether that is blessing or curse remains to be seen. But know this, Violet Winters. If you stand with Taken, you stand with all of us. We do not abandon our own, even when they are not born of our blood. Violet felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected acceptance. I do not deserve such kindness. Kindness is not about deserving, Kiona replied. It is about recognizing shared humanity. You have been hunted and afraid. We have been hunted and afraid. That makes us kin in the ways that matter. She reached out and touched Violet's cheek gently. Be strong, child. The storm is coming, and it will test everything you think you know about yourself. But remember, storms pass. What you build in the aftermath is what defines you. Then they were gone, disappearing into the forest with needies chattering excitedly about the red-haired woman and Elu's quiet laughter following them like music. Violet stood at the clearing's edge long after they had vanished, holding the carved wolf in her hand, feeling its weight like a promise. That night, Taken was restless. He paced the perimeter of camp multiple times, checking and rechecking their supplies, sharpening weapons that were already sharp. Violet watched him from the fire, recognizing the signs of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. Finally, she stood and walked to where he stood staring out at the darkening mountains. What did Kiona say to you? Violet asked. Taken did not turn. She said that I have been preparing to die for 3 years, and that perhaps it is time I prepared to live instead. Do you think she is right? I think she is always right. Which is why her words are so difficult to hear, Taken replied. He finally looked at Violet, his expression unguarded for once. I have kept myself apart because involvement means risk.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Risk means potential loss. Loss means more grief to add to what I already carry. It seemed simpler to remain alone. But you did not remain alone, Violet said softly. You chose to protect me. I did, Taken admitted. And that choice has brought everything I feared. Danger, complication, the possibility of failing someone again. But Kiona is right. I have been living as if I am already dead, and that is not living at all. Violet took his hand, rough and scarred, and held it between both of hers. Then let us be alive together. Let us face whatever comes not as people preparing to die, but as people choosing to fight for something that matters. Taken's fingers tightened around hers. You matter, Violet Winters. I need you to understand that. Whatever happens in the days ahead, you matter. So do you, she whispered. They stood like that as full darkness fell, 2 figures silhouetted against the firelight, holding onto each other and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something worth defending in a world that seemed determined to tear everything down. Behind them, the forest whispered its ancient secrets. And somewhere in the darkness, enemies gathered their strength for the confrontation that could no longer be avoided. But for this one moment, there was only warmth and connection and the quiet understanding that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible and the outcome uncertain. Some things demanded you stand and face the storm, not because you could win, but because surrender meant losing the only thing that truly mattered. The right to choose your own path and defend those who walked it beside you. And as the stars emerged one by one in the vast darkness above, Violet felt something she had not felt in years. Not safety, because safety was an illusion. Not certainty, because certainty was a lie. But something deeper and more durable. A sense of belonging that had nothing to do with places or papers, and everything to do with finding someone who saw you clearly and chose to stand with you anyway. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tomorrow would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. But tonight, they had each other and the fire, and the knowledge that they would face whatever came together. The storm arrived on the 6th day, not with rain but with blood. Violet woke to the sound of thunder rolling across the mountains. But when she emerged from the shelter, the sky was clear and merciless blue. The thunder came again, and this time she recognized it for what it was. Gunfire, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the valleys like the voice of something cruel and inevitable. Taken was already moving, his rifle in hand, his face carved from stone. Get dressed, he said without looking at her. Wear the darkest things you have. "We need to move." Violet did not waste time with questions. She pulled on the buckskin dress, now stained dark with earth and pine sap, and grabbed the knife Taken had given her. Her hands shook as she tied her hair back with a strip of leather. But she forced herself to breathe, to focus, to remember everything he had taught her about staying calm when fear threatened to swallow reason whole. By the time she emerged, Taken had already scattered the fire and was burying their supplies in a cache he had prepared for exactly this moment. "They are coming from the South Ridge," he said, his voice clipped and efficient. "At least a dozen men, maybe more. They are not trying to hide their approach. They want us to know they are coming. Why would they do that?" Violet asked, helping him cover the last of their supplies with leaves and branches. "Because they want us to run," Taken replied. "They have positioned men on the northern trails. This is not a hunt anymore. This is a trap, and we are standing in the middle of it." Violet felt ice slide down her spine. "Then what do we do?" Taken stood and scanned the tree line with eyes that missed nothing. "We do not give them what they expect. They think we will run north or try to hide here. Instead, we go west, through the ravine. It is difficult terrain, too steep for horses. If we move fast and stay quiet, we can reach the old mining tunnels before they realize we are gone. And then what?" Violet demanded, her voice rising despite her best efforts to stay calm. Taken looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something like fear in his eyes. Not fear for himself, but fear for her. Fear of failing again. Fear of watching another person he cared about be destroyed by forces he could not control. "Then we survive," he said. "One more day, one more hour, one more breath. That is all we can do." They moved through the forest like ghosts, Taken leading and Violet following in his footsteps, literally placing her feet where his had been to minimize their trail. Behind them, the sounds of men grew louder, voices calling to each other, the crash of bodies moving through underbrush without care or skill. They were confident, these hunters, certain that numbers and guns would overcome anything two desperate people could muster in defense. The ravine was worse than Violet had imagined. The slope dropped away at an angle that made her stomach lurch, loose shale sliding beneath every step, waiting to send the unwary tumbling into the rocky stream far below. Taken moved down it with the confidence of someone who had walked this path before, finding handholds in roots and rock that seemed invisible until he showed her where to grip. Halfway down, Violet's foot slipped. She gasped as she started to slide, scrabbling for purchase on stone that offered nothing but smooth betrayal. Taken's hand shot out and caught her wrist, his grip iron strong, pulling her back against the slope. They stayed frozen like that for a heartbeat, both breathing hard, both aware of how close she had come to falling. "I have you," Taken whispered. "Trust me, Violet." "I have you," she nodded, unable to speak past the fear choking her throat, and they continued down. By the time they reached the bottom, Violet's hands were scraped raw and her legs trembled with exhaustion, but they had made it. The ravine floor was narrow, barely wider than a wagon, with walls of stone rising on either side like the ribs of some ancient beast. Water trickled through the center, cold and clear, singing over rocks that had been worn smooth by centuries of passage. Taken led her upstream, moving quickly now that they were on more level ground. The ravine twisted and turned, hiding them from anyone who might look down from above, but also trapping them in a corridor with limited escape routes. Violet tried not to think about what would happen if Silas's men discovered where they had gone and simply waited at either end like spiders at the edges of a web. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the ravine opened into a wider space where centuries ago, men had come seeking gold and found only disappointment. The old mining tunnels gaped in the hillside like empty eye sockets, their wooden supports weathered and sagging but still standing. Taken approached the largest entrance cautiously, checking for signs of recent use or collapse. "Inside," he said, and Violet did not hesitate. The tunnel swallowed them into darkness that pressed against her eyes like a physical weight. She heard Taken moving ahead of her, heard the scrape of flint and steel, and then blessed light bloomed as he lit a small torch he had pulled from somewhere in his pack. The flame pushed back the darkness enough to reveal rough-hewn walls and a floor littered with the debris of abandoned dreams. "How far back does it go?" Violet asked, her voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. "Far enough," Taken replied. "There are multiple chambers and at least 2 other exits that I know of. If they find us here, we will have options. If they do not, we wait until nightfall and slip away while they search elsewhere." They moved deeper into the tunnel, past old pickaxes and broken sluice boxes, past the skeletal remains of hope that had died in darkness. The air grew colder and damper, carrying the mineral smell of deep earth and forgotten years. Finally, Taken stopped in a chamber where multiple tunnels intersected, creating a natural defensive position where they could see anyone approaching from several directions. He set the torch in a crack in the wall and began checking his weapons. Rifle loaded, knife sharp, bow strung and ready. Violet watched him work, recognizing the ritual of it. The way preparing for violence seemed to calm him rather than agitate him. She wondered what it had cost him to become this person. This warrior who moved through danger like other men move through morning routines. "Teach me," she said suddenly. Taken looked up from loading his revolver. "Teach you what? How to fight," Violet said. "Not just how to shoot at targets, but how to fight if they get close. How to hurt someone who is trying to hurt me." Taken studied her for a long moment, weighing something in his mind. Then he nodded and stood. "Come here. For the next hour, by torchlight in an abandoned mine while enemies searched for them above, Taken taught Violet the basics of survival combat. Not elegant or sporting, but brutal and practical. Where to strike to disable rather than kill. How to use her smaller size as an advantage rather than a weakness. How to break a grip. How to use momentum against an attacker. How to fight dirty because honor was a luxury for people who were not desperate. "If a man grabs you like this," Taken demonstrated, catching her wrist, "most people pull away. That is instinct, but it is wrong. You step in instead, closer than he expects, and you drive your other hand up into his throat or eyes or nose. Anywhere soft, anywhere that makes him let go and gives you time to run." Violet practiced the movements until her muscles burned in sweat, soaked through her dress despite the underground chill. Taken was patient, but demanding, making her repeat each technique until it became muscle memory rather than conscious thought. "In a real fight, you will not have time to think," he explained. "Your body must know what to do before your mind catches up." They were resting, sharing water from Taken's canteen when they heard it. Voices echoing down one of the distant tunnels, distorted by stone but unmistakably human. Taken's hand went immediately to his rifle. He gestured for Violet to move behind him, to stay silent, to prepare for whatever came next. The voices grew closer, accompanied by the scrape of boots on stone and the flickering glow of multiple torches. Violet counted at least 4 distinct voices, all male, all speaking with the casual confidence of men who believed they held all the advantages. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall and tried to slow her breathing, tried to become invisible through will alone. "They came this way, I am telling you," one voice insisted. "The tracks lead straight to this ravine, and there is no way out except through these old tunnels. So we flush them out," another voice replied, harder and more certain. "Set fires at the back exits, smoke them forward, pick them off when they run." "Simple. Boss wants the girl alive," a third voice cautioned. He was very specific about that. "We can kill the Indian, but she goes back breathing. Then we will be careful," the hard voice said. "But if she gets caught in the crossfire, well, accidents happen. Gannon will understand." Taken's jaw clenched so tight Violet could see the muscle jump beneath his skin. His finger moved to the trigger of his rifle, and she knew with absolute certainty that he was calculating ranges and angles, deciding which men to drop first if shooting started. She also knew that 4 against 1, even with surprise on their side, were terrible odds. And if there were more men outside waiting, it would be suicide. The voices were almost upon them now. Close enough that Violet could hear individual footsteps, could smell the tobacco smoke clinging to their clothes. Taken raised his rifle slowly, silently, sighting down the barrel at the tunnel opening where any moment now armed men would appear. But before they arrived, another sound cut through the underground darkness. A rumbling, low and ominous, that seemed to come from the stone itself. Dust began to fall from the ceiling, and the ground beneath Violet's feet trembled. The men in the tunnel shouted in alarm, their voices suddenly sharp with fear rather than confidence. "Cave in!" Someone screamed. Get out now." The rumbling grew louder, becoming a roar that drowned out everything else. Taken grabbed Violet and pulled her toward one of the side tunnels, away from the main chamber where the ceiling was beginning to crack and collapse. They ran through darkness punctuated only by the failing light of the dropped torch. Ran while behind them, the mountain seemed to tear itself apart in rage or judgment. They burst out into daylight through a narrow exit Violet had not even known existed, stumbling onto a rocky shelf high above the ravine floor. Behind them, a cloud of dust and debris exploded from the tunnel mouth, carrying with it the screams of men who had not been fast enough or lucky enough to escape the collapse. The entire hillside seemed to shift and settle, ancient timbers giving way at last to the weight they had held for decades. Tekken pulled Violet away from the edge, both of them coughing on dust that burned their lungs and coated their skin in gray powder. They moved along the shelf until they found a place where they could climb higher, away from the devastation below. Neither spoke until they reached a vantage point where they could see the ravine entrance and the chaos unfolding there. Men poured out of the tunnels in disorder, some carrying wounded companions, others just running in blind panic. At least 2 bodies lay unmoving in the debris field, crushed by falling stone or suffocated by gust. The neat trap they had laid had become a disaster of their own making. Their confidence turned to confusion and fear in the space of minutes. Was that natural? Violet asked, her voice hoarse from dust and shock. Taken shook his head slowly. No, those mines have been stable for 30 years. Someone brought them down deliberately, but who? Her question was answered by movement on the ridge above the ravine. Figures emerged from the tree line, not the suited hunters or badge-wearing marshals, but Modoc warriors dressed for war. Violet counted at least 8 of them, maybe more, led by a young man with a rifle slung across his back and determination written in every line of his posture. As she watched, he raised his hand in a signal that Taken seemed to understand. "Kiona," Taken said softly, something like awe in his voice. She called them. She gathered the young warriors and brought them here. Below, the surviving hunters were regrouping, trying to mount some kind of organized response. But they were shaken and disoriented, caught between the collapsed tunnels behind them and the armed Modoc warriors appearing on the ridges around them. The balance of power had shifted in a way none of them had anticipated. The young Modoc leader called out in English, his voice carrying across the ravine with authority. "You have hunted on our land without permission. You have threatened our people and disturbed our peace. Now you will leave, or you will die here. Choose quickly." One of the hunters, braver or more foolish than the others, raised his rifle. The shot echoed through the ravine, striking stone near where the young warrior stood. He did not flinch. Instead, he gave another signal, and suddenly the ridges came alive with arrows, a dozen at least, flying with deadly accuracy. The brave hunter fell with 3 shafts in his chest. The others dropped their weapons and raised their hands. "We are leaving," one of them shouted, his voice breaking with fear. "We are leaving, just let us go." The young warrior conferred briefly with the men around him, then nodded. "Take your wounded and your dead." Tell your boss that this land is protected. Tell him that if he wants the woman, he will have to come himself and face what waits for him. Tell him that we are done running, done hiding, done pretending that paper laws matter more than the laws written in blood and stone. The hunters scrambled to obey, grabbing their fallen and retreating down the ravine as fast as dignity would allow. Within minutes they had disappeared around the bend, leaving behind only scattered weapons and the settling dust of their humiliation. The Modoc warriors watched them go, then began to disperse back into the forest, melting away as silently as they had appeared, but the young leader remained, scanning the hillside until his eyes found Taken and Violet on their high perch. He raised his hand in salute, a gesture of respect between equals. Taken returned it, his face unreadable but his posture speaking of gratitude that went deeper than words could reach. "Who is he?" Violet asked. "His name is Chaitin," Taken replied. "He is Kayona's grandson, Nidus's older cousin. I knew him when he was barely old enough to hold a bow. Now he leads warriors into battle. He saved us," Violet said simply. "He saved all of us," Taken corrected. By standing together instead of alone, they changed what was possible. They showed Ganon's men that this is not a hunt they can win through force alone. They climbed down from their perch, carefully, making their way back toward where Chaitin waited with 2 other warriors. When they finally reached him, the young man smiled, the expression transforming his serious face into something warmer and more approachable. "Uncle," he said, using the term of respect. "Grandmother said you might need assistance." "It seems she was correct. It seems she always is," Taken replied, gripping Chaitin's forearm in the warrior's greeting. "Thank you. We would not have survived without your intervention. We protect our own," Chaitin said simply. Then he turned to Violet, studying her with frank curiosity. "So you are the one who has caused all this trouble. Grandmother speaks highly of you. She says you have a strong spirit." "I have a desperate spirit," Violet corrected. "There is a difference," Chaitin laughed. "Perhaps. But desperation paired with courage becomes something else entirely. Something worth defending." One of the other warriors stepped forward, younger than Chaitin but carrying himself with similar confidence. "The men who fled will return to their boss and tell him what happened. He will be angry. Humiliated men are dangerous men. Then we prepare for dangerous men," Taken said. "But not here, not in the open where they can surround us. We need to move to more defensible ground. There is a place," Chaitin said. "An old Modoc settlement in the high country, abandoned for years but still solid. Stone walls, clear sight lines, water source inside the perimeter. If Ganon comes again, let him come to ground of our choosing, where his numbers mean less and his rage works against him." Taken looked at Violet, a silent question in his eyes. She understood what he was asking. This was a choice, a commitment to stand and fight rather than continue running. It meant accepting help from people who owed her nothing, putting them in danger for her sake. It meant admitting that she could not survive alone. That survival itself sometimes required swallowing pride and accepting that strength came in many forms. "Yes," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "Let us go to this place. Let us make our stand." Chaitin nodded in approval. "Then we move now, before they regroup. Gather what you need." We travel light and fast. They moved through the mountains as the sun began its descent. A small band of warriors and 2 refugees, climbing higher into country where the air grew thin and the trees gave way to stone and sky. Violet's legs burned and her lungs ached, but she kept pace, driven by something that felt like hope mixed with defiance. Behind them, the valley spread out like a map of all the places she could have run to but had chosen not to. Ahead, the mountains rose like promises both beautiful and terrible. And somewhere in those valleys, Silas Ganon would be receiving news of his hunter's failure, would be calculating his next move, would be preparing for a confrontation that neither side could afford to lose. The storm was not over. In many ways, it had only just begun. But for the first time since she had fled the Silver Rose, Violet Winters was not running. She was walking towards something instead of away from it, and that made all the difference. The old settlement clung to the mountainside like a memory refusing to fade. Stone walls built by hands long dead still stood defiant against wind and time, encircling a space no larger than a town square, but positioned with strategic brilliance. From here, anyone approaching could be seen from a mile away, while the defenders remained protected by both elevation and architecture. A spring bubbled up from the rocks inside the perimeter, ensuring water even under siege. It was, Violet realized, a fortress built by people who understood that survival often meant choosing your battlefield before the enemy chose it for you. They arrived as twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and blood. Shaitan's warriors immediately began fortifying the existing defenses, stacking loose stones to fill gaps in walls, clearing sight lines, positioning supplies in protected corners. Taken moved among them with the ease of someone who had done this before, offering suggestions that were received with respect. His isolation apparently forgotten in the face of shared purpose. Violet found herself working alongside Elu, who had arrived with the warriors carrying medical supplies and food. The older woman showed her how to prepare bandages and poultices, how to set up a makeshift infirmary in one of the protected alcoves. Men prepare for battle by sharpening weapons, Elu explained as they worked. Women prepare by making ready to heal what battle breaks. Both are necessary. Both are honorable. I never thought of myself as honorable, Violet admitted, rolling strips of clean cloth. I sang in a saloon and poured whiskey for men who saw me as decoration. Where is the honor in that? Elu paused in her work and looked at Violet with eyes that seemed to see past surface judgments. You survived in a world built to break women like you. You recognized your cage and chose to escape it, even knowing the risks. You learned new skills when you could have given up. You stand now with people you barely know, preparing to face violence rather than surrender your freedom. If that is not honor, then the word has no meaning. Violet felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them away. There would be time for crying later if they survived. If they did not, tears would not matter anyway. She returned to her work with renewed focus, letting the repetitive motions calm her racing thoughts. As full darkness fell, Kiona arrived with needies and several other women from the scattered Modoc families. They brought more supplies, more medicine, and something less tangible but equally important, the presence of community. The reminder that what they fought for was not abstract but embodied in the faces of children and elders, who deserved to live without fear. Needies immediately sought out Violet, his young face serious. I brought you something, he said, holding out a small leather pouch. It is salt mixed with herbs. If you get hurt, pack it in the wound. It will hurt worse than the injury itself, but it will keep the infection away. Violet took the pouch carefully, touched by the gesture. Thank you, Needies. You are very brave to be here. The boy shook his head. I am not brave. I am scared. But my uncle says being scared and doing what must be done anyway is the truest kind of courage. So I am trying to be scared and useful at the same time. Violet smiled despite the weight pressing on her chest. Then we are alike, you and I, scared and useful together. That night, they gathered around a carefully shielded fire, eating dried meat and journey bread while Chayton outlined what they knew and what they expected. Scouts report that Gannon himself is coming, he said without preamble. He left Sacramento 2 days ago with at least 20 armed men. They will arrive by tomorrow afternoon, perhaps sooner if they push through the night. 20 men, one of the younger warriors said nervously. We have 8 fighters, and only Uncle Taken and I have real combat experience. Numbers are not everything, Taken replied from where he sat checking his rifle. We have position, preparation, and purpose. They have anger and arrogance. History shows which advantage tends to prevail. History also shows that determined men with guns can overwhelm smaller forces no matter how well positioned. Chayton countered, not arguing but acknowledging reality. We need to be clear about what we face. Some of us may not survive tomorrow. Silence followed this statement, heavy and honest. Violet looked around the circle at faces illuminated by firelight, young and old, all bearing the weight of a choice they had made to stand rather than hide. She thought about Silas Gannon, imagined him riding through the night toward this place, convinced that his money and his men and his sense of ownership gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. She thought about all the time she had smiled and served and stayed silent while men like him treated her as less than human. "I want to speak," she said suddenly, surprising herself. All eyes turned to her. "I need to say something before tomorrow comes." Taken nodded encouragement. Violet stood, her legs unsteady but her voice finding strength. "You do not owe me this. Any of you. I am not Modoc. I am not your family. I brought this trouble to your land, and you have every right to turn me over to Gannon and let me face whatever consequences he intends. But you have chosen to stand with me instead, to risk yourselves for someone you barely know. I need you to understand that I see that. I honor that. And if I survive tomorrow, I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what you have given me." Kiona spoke from her place near the fire, her voice carrying the authority of years and wisdom. "Child, you still do not understand. This is not about you alone. Yes, Gannon comes for you, but what he represents has been coming for all of us for many years. He is every land grabber, every treaty breaker, every man who believes that might makes right, and that some people matter less than others. If we let him take you without resistance, we tell the world that we accept that judgment. We say that we are willing to be erased quietly." She stood with difficulty, leaning on her walking stick, but her eyes blazed with fierce life. "Tomorrow, we do not fight for Violet Winters alone. We fight for Ayana, Taken's sister, who died because no one stood with her. We fight for every child like Needy's who deserves to grow up free. We fight for ourselves and for the generations who will come after, so they might inherit a world slightly less cruel than the one we were given." The warriors made sounds of agreement, fists thumping against chests in affirmation. Even Needy's, young as he was, struck his small fist against his heart and nodded with determination that seemed too large for his years. Violet sat back down, overwhelmed by the weight of it all, by the realization that her personal flight from bondage had somehow become tangled with larger struggles. Older wounds, deeper hungers for justice that had waited generations for satisfaction. Taken moved to sit beside her, his shoulder pressing against hers in silent support. "They are right," he said quietly for her ears alone. "This stopped being about just you the moment I chose to protect you. Every choice creates ripples. We cannot control where they travel, only how we face the waves when they return." "I am afraid," Violet whispered. "Good," Taken replied. "Fear keeps you alert. It is only when fear paralyzes that it becomes the enemy." They sat together in the firelight while plans were made and duties assigned. Chayton positioned his warriors at key points along the walls, each with clear fields of fire and fallback positions. Taken would take the highest point, where his rifle skills could be used to maximum effect. The women and needies would remain in the protected center, ready to tend wounded or fight if the walls were breached. It was a plan built on hope and desperation in equal measure, as the others settled into uneasy rest, taking sleep where they could find it before dawn. Violet found herself unable to close her eyes. She walked the perimeter of the settlement, running her hands along stone walls that had stood for longer than she had been alive. She wondered about the people who had built this place, what they had been defending against, whether they had succeeded or whether their bones lay somewhere in these mountains. Markers of a stand that had not been enough. They survived, Taken said, appearing beside her like a shadow gaining substance. The people who built this place. They held it against raiders for an entire winter, then negotiated a peace that lasted 2 generations. It is possible to defend what matters and live to tell the story, but not guaranteed, Violet said. No, Taken agreed. Never guaranteed, but possible. Sometimes that has to be enough. They stood together looking out at the darkness that hid both danger and possibility. Violet thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the Silver Rose to a stagecoach to a hollow log to this mountain fortress. Each step had seemed like random flight, but looking back, she could see a pattern, a path that had led her toward something she had not known she was seeking. Not safety, because safety was an illusion. Not freedom, because freedom was meaningless without purpose. But belonging, connection, the sense that her life mattered not because of what she could offer men like Gannon, but because of who she chose to become when every easy path was closed. If I die tomorrow, she said slowly, testing the words, I want you to know that these last weeks have been the freest I have ever felt. Even running, even hunted, even terrified. I got to choose. That is something Silas never gave me. You are not going to die tomorrow, Taken said with a certainty she wished she could feel. You cannot promise that. No, he admitted. But I can promise that if death comes for you, it will have to go through me first. And I am significantly harder to kill than I look. Violet surprised herself by laughing, the sound small and fragile but real. You look very hard to kill. Then imagine how difficult I actually am, Taken replied. And there was something in his voice that might have been humor if humor had a sharp edge and a dark heart. Dawn came too quickly and too slowly, time playing tricks in the hour before battle. The sun rose blood red over the eastern peaks, painting the world in shades that seemed ominous or hopeful, depending on how you chose to interpret them. The defenders took their positions in silence, each lost in private thoughts about what the day would bring. Violet stood with Elu and Kiona in the protected center, a rifle in her hands that felt both foreign and familiar, a tool she hoped she would not need, but was prepared to use if necessity demanded. They did not have to wait long. Just after mid-morning, scouts signaled the approach of riders from the south. Violet climbed to where she could see without being seen and watched as Silas, Gannon's force emerged from the tree line like ants boiling from a disturbed nest. 20 men as reported, all armed, all mounted. Moving with the confidence of people who believed that overwhelming force was the answer to every question. And at their head rode Silas himself, unmistakable even at this distance. Tall and broad, dressed in fine clothes inappropriate for wilderness travel, sitting his horse like a king surveying conquered territory. Violet felt her stomach clench at the sight of him, memories flooding back of his hands and his voice, and his absolute certainty that she belonged to him like furniture or livestock. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Anger, clean and bright and burning, at the audacity of this man who believed he could chase her to the ends of the earth and drag her back to captivity. The riders stopped at the base of the slope, just beyond rifle range, and Gannon dismounted. He pulled something from his saddlebag, a speaking trumpet that would amplify his voice, and raised it to his lips. His words carried clearly across the distance, each one striking like a blow. Violet Winters, I know you are up there. I know you can hear me. I have come a long way to retrieve what belongs to me, and I am not leaving without you. Send her down now, and the rest of you can walk away from this. Refuse, and I will burn you out and hang whoever survives for harboring a fugitive and a thief. Silence answered him. Gannon waited, then raised the trumpet again. I have 20 armed men and the law on my side. You have walls that will not stop bullets and righteousness that will not stop hemp. This is your last chance to surrender before people die for no good reason. Chayton stood then, visible on the wall, his rifle held loosely but ready. His voice carried without need for artificial amplification, trained by years of calling across valleys and mountains. The only person who will die for no good reason today is you, Gannon, if you are foolish enough to attack. This woman is not property. She owes you nothing. Your law is paper that burns. Our law is written in blood and stone and cannot be erased by men with guns and inflated self-importance. Gannon's face, visible even at this distance, flushed with rage. You are making a mistake, boy. I have friends in high places. I can bring the army down on your heads. I can have every Modoc in these mountains rounded up and shipped to reservations where you will rot until you forget what freedom tastes like. Then bring them, Chayton called back. Bring your army and your friends and all the might you can muster. We will still be here, still standing, still refusing to pretend that your paper matters more than our lives. You want the woman? Come and take her. But know that every step you climb toward us might be your last. For a long moment, Gannon stood frozen, his face a mask of fury and disbelief that anyone would dare defy him so openly. Then he turned and barked orders to his men. They dismounted and began moving up the slope in a loose skirmish line, using trees and rocks for cover, advancing with the caution of professionals who understood that overconfidence killed. The battle for the mountain settlement was about to begin. The first shot came from Taken's rifle, a deliberate warning that struck the ground 3 feet in front of the lead attacker. The man froze, and Gannon's advance halted as his men realized that the high ground advantage was not theoretical, but lethal. Chayton called out again, his voice carrying absolute conviction. Turn back now, Gannon. This is your last chance to leave with your life. But Silas Gannon had not built an empire by accepting defeat, and pride would not let him retreat before a handful of Modoc warriors and a runaway saloon girl. He roared orders to his men, and they surged forward, rifles raised, convinced that numbers would overwhelm preparation. They were wrong. What followed was not the pitched battle Gannon expected, but a brutal lesson in tactical disadvantage. Every time his men found cover and tried to advance, arrows and carefully aimed rifle fire drove them back. The stone walls absorbed their bullets while defenders remained protected, picking their shots, making every round count. Within minutes, 3 of Gannon's men lay wounded on the slope, and the rest had retreated to reconsider their strategy. Violet watched from her position, heart hammering, rifle ready but unused. She saw Taken reload with mechanical precision, saw Chayton coordinate his warriors with hand signals, saw Elu preparing to treat the wounded who would inevitably come. The choreography of violence unfolded with terrible beauty, each person knowing their role, executing it without hesitation. This was what it meant to stand together against impossible odds, not glory or heroism, just grim determination and the refusal to surrender what mattered. Hours passed in stalemate. Gannon's men made several more attempts to advance but were driven back each time. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Violet saw Gannon pacing at the base of the slope, gesturing angrily, clearly arguing with someone. Then movement, riders approaching from the south, not reinforcements but something else entirely. A man in a marshal's uniform, accompanied by 2 deputies, riding hard. Marshal Thornton dismounted and confronted Gannon, their argument visible even at this distance. Raised voices carried up the slope, words indistinct but tone unmistakable. Gannon was being ordered to stand down, to withdraw his men, to accept that this hunt was over. The marshal pointed back toward the valley, towards civilization and law that even Gannon's money could not completely corrupt. For a moment, it seemed Gannon would refuse, would order his men to attack regardless of official sanction. But Thornton's hand rested on his pistol, and the deputies moved to flank him, making clear that enforcement would follow defiance. Finally, with visible reluctance, Gannon mounted his horse. But before riding away, he raised his speaking trumpet one last time. "This is not over, Violet." His voice echoed across the mountain. "You can hide in these rocks with your savages, but the world is bigger than one mountain. Someday you will have to come down, and when you do, I will be waiting. Violet stepped forward then, visible on the wall, her voice rising clear and strong. Then you will wait forever, Silas, because I am not hiding anymore. I am standing. And these people you call savages have shown me more humanity in weeks than you showed in years. I choose them. I choose this mountain. I choose freedom over your gilded cage. And if you are fool enough to return, you will find that some things are worth dying for. And that makes them impossible to defeat. Gannon's face contorted with rage. But Marshal Thornton was already turning his horse, giving him no choice but to follow or face arrest himself. Slowly, the armed men retreated down the slope, gathering their wounded, leaving behind dropped weapons and shattered pride. They disappeared into the tree line, and for the first time in what felt like forever, silence returned to the mountain. The defenders did not celebrate. Too exhausted and too aware of how close they had come to bloodshed that would have stained this ground red. Instead, they tended wounds, repaired defenses damaged by gunfire, and sat together as the sun descended toward the western peaks. Violet found herself beside Taken, both of them too weary for words. Just breathing the same air and being grateful for the continued privilege of breath. "It is over," Violet said finally. Testing the words, "for now," Taken replied. "Men like Gannon do not forget. But today, we won something more important than a battle. We proved that resistance is possible, that standing together changes what can be taken from us. That is a victory worth claiming." 3 months later, as winter settled over the mountains with snow that transformed the world into something clean and new, Violet stood in the old settlement that had become her home. The Modoc families had returned to this high place, rebuilding what had been abandoned, creating a community that existed in the spaces between official jurisdictions and paper laws. Here, they lived by older agreements, by bonds of mutual support and shared struggle. Taken approached carrying firewood, his movements easy and unhurried. In the months since the siege, something had shifted between them. Barriers falling away until what remained was simply two people who had chosen each other through trial and adversity. No grand declarations, no formal ceremonies. Just the quiet accumulation of shared days and the understanding that some bonds required no official sanction to be real. "Kiona wants to know if you are ready," Taken said. Setting down the wood, Violet nodded, touching the dress Elu had made for her. Simple buckskin decorated with beadwork that told the story of a woman who had run toward freedom and found family. Today, the community would gather to recognize what everyone already knew. That Violet Winters and Taken Wolftracker were bound not by paper but by choice renewed each morning when they woke and decided again to stand together. The ceremony was brief, conducted in both Modoc and English, witnessed by people who understood that love was not about ownership, but about two souls choosing to walk the same path. Kiona blessed them with words older than the mountains, and Chaitin sang a song of warriors who found peace, and Needis presented them with a carving of two wolves running side by side. As night fell and the community celebrated with food and stories around fires that pushed back the winter darkness, Violet stood with Taken looking out at stars that seemed close enough to touch. She thought about the girl who had jumped from a train in a torn wedding dress, terrified and desperate. That girl seemed like someone from another life. Someone who had not yet learned that freedom was not a destination, but a choice made daily, sometimes hourly, to refuse the cages others built and to defend the space where you could be fully human. "Do you regret it?" Taken asked quietly. "Giving up the easier path," Violet laughed, the sound carrying genuine joy. There was no easier path. There was only survival disguised as life. This, what we have built here, this is living. Difficult and uncertain, and sometimes terrifying, but real. I would not trade it for all the safety in the world. Taken pulled her close, and they stood together watching the stars wheel overhead in their ancient dance. Below them, The valleys held towns and laws, and men like Gannon, who would never understand what they had found in these high places. But up here, in the thin air where the peaks touched sky, a different kind of law prevailed. The law of chosen family, of loyalty earned through shared struggle, of love that asked nothing but gave everything. And as snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering the world in white forgiveness, Violet Winters, now called Wolf Tracker by those who mattered, smiled and turned toward the warmth of home. Not the home she had been born to, but the home she had claimed through courage and defiance and the willingness to believe that a better life was possible if you were brave enough to fight for it. Behind them, the mountains stood eternal, witness to endings that were also beginnings, to stories that refused to follow expected paths, to the truth that freedom was never given but always taken, defended, and cherished by those who understood its true cost and infinite value.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.